What's the deal with International Women's Day? I think that's the way Seinfeld would say it anyway. Here to help me decode International Women's Day is second-time guest, Catherine Harrison, who will now explain to me what this International Women's Day thing is all about. Is that too much?
Is that too much to ask of
Yes.
you? Yes.
Yes. You're representing all women today. So
Right.
how are you? You were here about a year ago.
Yeah, has it been a year?
About a
Wow.
year ago.
Okay.
So what's happened to you in the last year? What have you done?
Lots of things. I'm rounding out completing a master's in applied psychology around the biopsychosocial aspects of health and well-being, and as it applies to human-centered leadership, which is kind of my jam, as you know. That's taken up the bulk of my time, as you can imagine. I'm doing it in a very concentrated way. So I've been a full-time student, and continuing to write and to share and to discuss and to debate and to prod various related topics. Still spend a lot of time in the music industry space talking about mental health advocacy and addiction recovery.
I
So
saw
I've
an
continued
article you
Yeah.
wrote. Where was that?
That was in Canadian Musician Magazine
Yes.
in January.
Right.
And doing some workshops and some support work with music organizations around the country as
Right.
well, around various aspects of optimal health and well-being. So, yeah, that's what I've been doing.
So it's International Women's Day on Wednesday.
Mm.
That's if you're, but this is evergreen content. So
Yeah.
if you're watching this later, it doesn't really matter. Now on LinkedIn, similar to the first time you caught my attention, on LinkedIn you commented on a long post by Sophie Walker, who used to be a journalist in England and was the founding leader of the Women's Equity Party in the UK. And her post started with, a week to go till we hit the annual corporate calamity that is also known as hashtag International Women's Day 2023. If you are planning to participate in this branding bun fight, here are some handy tips to survive until you have to do another 24 hours of performative feminism next year. And then you liked that and said, all of this, stop the performative hogwash-laden language and get to consistent, meaningful action.
Right.
Do you regret any of that?
I know. I'll double down on it. Yeah. So I will not speak for all women for the first part. I will speak for me, this woman. I will represent conversations I've had. I will represent decades of experience I've had. I will represent the current literature and research on the subject. And share with you, I guess, my thoughts on it and the reality, which is it's another one of these non-binary both and situations, right? Which is, I guess, just around the concept of any day, because now there's a day for everything.
Yes.
There's a day for everything. It's usually about a marginalized group. Mm-hmm. In some iteration. And I think that there's a lot of value in noting, recognizing, celebrating, bringing attention to whatever that group is, and whatever the ideal state for that group is. So on the one hand, great. On the other hand, and equally important, is what does this do? Like, what does, in this case, International Women's Day do? What do the hashtags do? What does the corporate wokeness do? What does it do? And that's where I think that post really spoke to me, and which is why I added to it and forwarded it. It is like many things, and I talk about this in all other aspects of my human-centered leadership and optimal health and well-being spaces, is that there is a dichotomy and a misalignment between the language of values and the actions of values. Right. So there's a lot of language around International Women's Day and, oh my God, this is so amazing, and la, 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 la. And even companies and organizations have policies and written practices and will hashtag the crap out of this and probably spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, hiring a marketing team to like brand their thing. But they don't actually do anything meaningful on a daily basis in their organizational cultures. Right. And that to me is where the hogwash comes in, and that's my polite way of saying something else.
So it's her words, but what do you think performative feminism is?
Well, and I don't even know if it's performative feminism per se. It's just performative for this. But sure, let's just use that. Performative feminism, and again, I'm not the expert on this subject. This is purely just, this. You're
closer to being an expert than I am.
True.
Though, so
that is true.
I know nothing about women, so.
I think how I perceive it is how that could be defined, which is I'm acting as if this is of great importance to me. I'm acting as if this will be activated, integrated, measured, and sustained in my daily behavioral practices. I'm acting as if. That's performative in my mind, which means it doesn't necessarily equate to the real daily behaviors, tangible, observable, measurable, sustainable behaviors that is actually driving meaningful change within the equality and equity space of the genders. Of men
so
and women.
It's kind of a marketing thing, and they slap a logo on it to maybe score some points on one day or 1 week or whatever. Is that fair
I think
to say?
so. And again, this can be applied to almost anything. And
yes,
there's some interesting, like I was saying earlier, like there's the corporate wokeness is a thing now, which is different than corporate social responsibility, which is a concept that's been around for probably 30 years-ish, which is quite meaningful, that within the capitalist space, again, not all bad, not all good, but there is a corporate social responsibility which is important. But now we've gone to an extreme, and now we have this thing called corporate wokeness, which is how do I, as a corporate entity, tether to something that's trendy and really woke to appear as though I'm really cool. And there's pros and cons to doing that.
Okay, so when you're talking like that, it makes me think, and you're active in the mental health space, as we just talked about as well. It makes me think of that Bell Let's Talk thing. What do you think about that? Because I have an opinion about Bell Let's Talk.
Yeah, and don't sue me for slander. I feel that is, it's a great brand, it's a great theme. It's a great idea. It brings to light the fact that mental health is stigmatized. People don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about mental health like they want to talk about other physiological health issues. Right. So on that, I think it's great. However, it is performative in nature. And one thing I have heard repeatedly from people in the telecommunications space is that company itself is actually not a mentally health environment. In fact, can be very toxic, and therefore, and that's a great example of what is known as sort of a hypocrisy penalty, where a corporation claims something, and it is known to not be true, and it's a backlash. There's what's known, it triggers a hypocrisy penalty.
They're definitely getting backlash now, a few years into it,
right?
For sure, because they paint themselves into a bit of a corner, because they have often had layoffs within weeks of that day, right?
Yeah.
So to their chagrin, really, and people don't forget about it either.
Right.
Because then the next year, even in anticipating that day, people are, by the way, I was laid off 2 years ago. By the way, you ain't so great on this issue.
Right. And to be clear, corporate layoffs are unavoidable in some cases, and they cannot or should not be explicitly tethered to mental health. So the issue is, how does a company do corporate layoffs? Yeah. That's where we actually have the mental health and holistic health conversation, because there are times when a company actually needs to right its ship in terms of resources, including staffing, etc. But it's how they do things that are either aligned with their language of values or misaligned with those values.
That Bell Let Stock Day rubbed me wrong from the very beginning, and it was because they put their name first. And I'm sure all the marketing and the PR people were giving themselves high fives, and then every retweet or whatever, it was a nickel. I think they stopped
Yeah.
that this year.
Oh, interesting.
And so people kept doing it. This is great. They'll pay. But meanwhile, they're getting all the bells just flashing all over the internet. And it just felt awkward to me that they put them, it's just the language that they put themselves first in that. And did they really need to be in that at all? They
Yeah.
could have been, let's talk, or something about mental health, brought to you by Bell.
Yes.
Just something subtle.
Yes.
It's like there's a baseball field around here that someone paid for, and we don't need to say the car company logo, but there's like 20 logos. Like, I get it. Maybe how about one logo? I get it. I appreciate that you paid for the baseball field, but why?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And but that's an interesting conversation. and I think that, again, and perhaps I'm full of it. That's highly possible. There's one thing around, like, baseball diamond, have a logo. I'm going to invest all this money. I'm going to use it as a branding opportunity.
Yeah.
There's another thing when we talk about health and mental health, or equity and marginalization, and the challenge. I just read a really interesting paper published through the Harvard Journal around the challenge of this, where companies will not face that hypocrisy penalty I referred to earlier if they're actually more explicit around, we're using this as a marketing campaign. It's when they take this moral high ground, and that's the performative piece, and they come across as this, and then people go, not so fast.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't align with the reality and our experiences and what you said and did over here. And so I think that's where we're getting that's where we get these kind of comments around something that could be really good. Let's take a day to actually reflect and recognize, what are we doing every day? Take a day to reflect on, how are we in fact integrating our policies and values every day in our organizations. That would be a good use of our time. But it's more just like one day a year, everybody hug yourself, and by the way, I'm totally allergic to that campaign this year. I don't like it one bit. Have you seen it?
No. Hugging? Everyone hugging each other? You're against hugging? Okay.
I love hugging. And again, I'll probably get in trouble for this. And here's the other thing: intention versus impact. I have no doubt that the intention is positive.
Right.
And it's difficult to do campaigns that everybody's happy with. The campaign for this year is Embrace Equity. I like it generally. Sure, embrace. Who wouldn't want to embrace equity? And so the campaign is everyone like doing this.
Right.
And I think that feeds deeply into the stereotypical gender roles that women play, like being this nurturing, soft, huggy, touchy. Like,
right.
It in my mind, it is not in any way empowering. It doesn't actually promote equity. I would like to see a more activating verb there. And to me, embracing, although it's a verb, but it's the kind of a passive thing, right? I'd like to see activate equity, catalyze equity, something like a little.
It's not really what you're talking about. You're talking about, equal pay and a lot of benefits that
talking about a lot, yeah. And so
get.
I think even that has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
The pay?
No, just that theme this year. Embrace equity is like,
right.
Okay. But yeah, we can get into, the difference between equality and equity.
International Women's Day. So what are a couple of, just off the top of your head, the biggest issues facing women in the workplace today in 2023?
Okay. My opinion. And based on some of the...
It's always your opinion.
Yeah, so. I know, but I want to be clear that I am not a de facto expert in this space. I have experience. I have knowledge, and I did, I did do a bit of a literature search just to know that I'm not completely speaking out of both sides of my mouth. So one of the primary issues is that, there's a good conversation going on right now with respect to the difference between equality and equity. Equality means everybody gets access to the same opportunities, right? Equal opportunity. But equity means that there are things put in place to actually bring equal outcomes, and that's very different. So an analogy that often gets used is equality means everybody gets a pair of shoes, but they get the same pair of shoes. They get a pair of men's size 9 court shoes. What it doesn't mean is that 4-year-old who has a size 4 and that woman who has a size 6 and that person who has a prosthetic leg and that one, they all have the same shoes, but they don't perform to the same way, and they're not going to have the same outcomes. Only people who are men, size 9, right, will actually have positive outcomes with that. So the notion of, well, women are given equal opportunity, therefore everything's equitable, not true. Because representation doesn't equal inclusion, does not equal power. Right. So even though we may have 50-50 men and women at a given manager level in the STEM program. So, for example, there's even more women than men in STEM programs right now. Even though there may be higher numbers of representation, it does not mean that they actually have inclusion. And inclusion means that they have power, that they have a voice at the table, that they have decision making for not just the daily practices, but the infrastructural and systemic ways that things happen. And that's a big disparity even now. So there's a lot of great research around, women who are, I read a paper the other day, women in the political sciences who represent, let's say, 50% of the graduating class, but only represent 20% of tenured professors. They don't get hired, and if they do get hired, they don't stay. Why? Because the organizations actually don't have in place practices that enable equitable outcomes for women, whether it's the culture, which is not conducive to, it's not devoid of harassment or biased behaviors. It is not actually conducive to having families. I mean, the jury has definitely concluded that the reality is women do more unpaid work in the world than ever when it comes to household, when it comes to raising the families, et cetera. So there's a lot of systemic biases, even by women, that continue to be in play. And so that's why we have to keep talking about this. But like that's the kind of conversation that would be cool, as opposed to embrace equity.
So let's go over her list. This is Sophie Walker again, and it's just a lot of it's very lighthearted too, right?
Yeah.
But, it says pay your women speakers, benchmark their rate around the last invoice you got from a top male consultant. I mean, you can jump in anytime you want, right? Don't make anything pink. So I guess you get sick of seeing these things and everyone wears pink for a day and that sort of thing. At any panel event, refrain from asking either of these questions, but is it really a problem? And B, what about men? If you are planning an event, evening event, provide on-site childcare and pay babysitting fees. Benchmark the latter around your top male consultant's day rate. Now, you were in the workforce full-time when you had a child. So what was that like for you? What were some of the problems that you had?
Well, I can tell
you needed to leave work early sometimes. Did you? Or?
Yeah, and I need to leave work early, or just leave work, period, if there was, an emergency or whatever. I was fortunate that I had an engaged father available also, although I was definitely the primary childcare parent. I made decisions, but here's the thing. I made decisions in my career because I was a mother that precluded my ascension into other more powerful positions. For one, I made specific decisions that would enable me to be home more, to be proximal to my child. So that in and of itself,
therefore altering your career path.
Absolutely.
So you need to go to Asia if you expect to come back here and be president or something.
Right.
Like that,
or you need to do this, but that means you're traveling 70% of the time. Well, right. And some people do that, and that's a choice.
Yeah.
That wasn't something that I wanted to do. That wasn't something that was going to fit with my belief system around what I wanted to do for the optimal well-being of my child and for me as the mother. I also have explicit firsthand experiences of getting a job after a man in a senior position and getting a different title and lower pay, even though it was the same job.
Right.
I saw that play out in many, many instances. Same job description, different title, different pay.
So it's a subtle thing,
Same
but you
title,
know what it.
different pay.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that's still going on, presumably?
Yeah, it is.
In a subtle way.
In a subtle way.
How do you fix that?
Well, this is the $1 million question.
Because you need leverage, don't you? How do you withhold your services? I mean,
yeah,
there's always someone else there to take the job. So
that's the $1 million question, Jim. Though, how do you fix it? I think it's a long game. It is. It's not a simple answer. It is going to be a combination of both individuals making conscious choices and systems and infrastructural changes happening slowly and painfully, because the people in power right now benefit from that. I mean, that's just the reality. It's not going to change overnight. I think it's actually going to be a cultural generational shift in the coming years. I'm hopeful that the next generation sees things slightly differently, and as they become leaders, will actually be more inclined to align language of values with actions of values.
So it's kind of as the boomers kind of die off, basically.
You said it, not me.
Technically, I'm a boomer, barely, but I'm a boomer. But certainly, people in white guys in power, 10 or 20 years older than me, think differently. Right?
You said it, not me, but I do agree with you, Jim.
Well, very different generation, right?
Yeah.
So and you see that all the time, right?
Yeah, and that's where you get the performative things, because those individuals, again, and I don't think that there's not a pernicious attempt. They'll say, I love women. I have daughters. I have granddaughters. And they'll say, we have policies. We've invested in this program. We've invested in training. We've invested in this. We have a International Women's Day event every year. We have 50% women managers. But what they don't do is they don't align the cultural behaviors on a daily basis to those values.
Yeah.
They can't see it, for one thing. It's an unconscious bias in many cases. And if they do see it, they don't want to see it because it doesn't serve them, right? And so that therein it lies one of the biggest issues, and it may just take some, time. But I think we need to be preparing younger generations for that eventuality, so that we don't just unconsciously or because of momentum just continue to perpetuate the same things. Right? Because that's easy to do too. The path of least resistance is like, well,
So Sophie Walker actually mentions hugs on her list.
Oh.
Number 8, avoid suggestions that equality will make for a softer, gentler workplace. More hugs at the end of difficult meetings, etc. Women aren't naturally empathetic, mostly, and especially now, they're very pissed off. Ignore this point at your peril. So that's a good one.
So that's an example of the gender stereotypes, right? Well, men are like this and women are like this, and if this, then that, and it's just simply not true. That men and women are socialized to leverage and behavioralize certain aspects of human psychological concepts more than others, but it doesn't mean that women are naturally more empathetic and men are naturally more competitive. Doesn't bear out.
Point number 9, have a look at last year's proclamations about improving female representation at the top, on the board, in middle management, on your R&D teams. If these airy claims have not been met, I refer you to point 5, which is check the organization's pay gap.
Yeah. So what I love about this is what I mentioned at the top of our conversation, is if International Women's Day was a day where organizations said, for this day, we are actually going to have a review of the past 12 months and the promises that we made and the policies and practices that we have, and the training interventions that we've invested in, and see how we have activated, integrated, measured, and sustained these behaviors and what the outcomes have been in terms of equitable outcomes, that would be a great use of our time. But simply to say we're going to hire our marketing team to create a really cool, splashy, slogan and beautiful thing, and we're going to look like this woke organization, but not do anything different.
Yeah. Point 10, if at any point on March 8th you find yourself thinking, why am I doing this? Congratulations, you have finally stumbled on the essential rule of International Women's Day 2023. Don't do anything without first asking the women you take for granted 364 days a year what they might want instead.
Yeah. And I think also that speaks to when you say, I know it was sort of tongue in cheek earlier. Okay, Catherine, you're speaking on behalf of all women. But to me, that point is about that. Women are individuals, just like men are individuals. Human beings are individuals. And although that there are collective needs and some common needs, I think that's a great suggestion. Talk to the women in your life. Talk to the women in your family life, your social life, your community life, your work life, education life, healthcare life, whatever community you're, and say, hey, on this day, I want to understand what's the biggest challenge for you? What can I do to best help, serve, learn, understand, whatever? And you don't even have to, it doesn't have to be a big debate. It can just be like, the goal is learning and the goal is commitment to just something progressive and meaningful.
Point 10A. So she's got 10A, 10B, so she got stuck on 10. Do not, on any account, host any International Women's Day 2023 training courses for women on how to be confident like men, learn to ask better for a pay raise like men, or memorize handy tips to get that promotion that keeps going to their male colleague, or you'll have me to deal with. 10B, make sure your contractual fine print agrees to full payment of any women you've hired in the event of a last-minute cancellation when you realize you've bitten off more than you can chew.
Can I speak to 10A for a moment?
Sure.
So I applaud her for adding that there once again, because often when we think about women moving into leadership positions, the goal is to make women behave more like men. And that's what she's getting at there. These little workshops on how to be more confident, how to ask for a raise like a man, how to be like a man, how to be this.
How to dress, too, sometimes, right?
And so it's more about, and this is deep in my space of human-centered leadership, is we need to develop human-centered leadership practices, not man-centered leadership practices or women-centered leadership practices, human-centered leadership practices that are practiced by both men and women, by all genders, that actually optimize the health and well-being of humans within the workplace, because that is good for business.
Right.
And what the 10A speaks to is right now what we say to women is, in order to be successful and get a seat at the table and have power at that table, you got to learn how to be a man. You got to learn how to act like a man. Even if they don't say it explicitly, that's the message. And that doesn't serve anybody.
Right. It's like I'm looking for a killer kind of thing to
and
close
you
a
know
deal
what?
or whatever.
I talk to women all the time, and I've had this experience myself, and a lot of women will say, the worst boss I ever had was a woman. First of all, people are people, woman or man. So you might just have somebody who is just a deeply antisocial person. But also, many women, as they move through the ranks, if they are ambitious, and that's a dirty word for women, but not for men, if they are ambitious and they move through the ranks, they often feel and learn that they better behave in the same way that men behave to get to those high-powered positions. Now, when a man behaves in that way, he's seen as assertive and confident and oh yeah, he's like, he won't put up with anything, whatever. But when a woman behaves in that way, people are very uncomfortable.
Right.
So there's a whole bunch of nuances, and it all comes down to our sort of socialization and our culturalization and our stereotypical biases that we have about each other and about ourselves.
So that whole ambition angle. So you still think that's a thing? Like women are not allowed to be ambitious, or it's just an unattractive trait,
Well,
or seen as an
it's seen as an
unattractive.
unattractive trait, and sometimes subconsciously. But there's some pretty good research data on that. That there are certain words that don't line up for people because we've been culturalized. That
Right.
ambition is, it's not a very ladylike thing. And I know that sounds
Right.
very sort of Edwardian,
1950s. Yeah.
well, or 50s, but there is still a negative attribution with respect to an ambitious woman versus an ambitious man.
Right. I guess, how do you get the job without asking for it? You know what I mean? That next job up the ladder. Don't you have to, if you're in sales, don't you have to ask for the sale? Don't they tell everyone to do that? So did you experience something like that yourself in
How do
your,
you mean?
well, again, it's that naked ambition. Like, how do you, if you're a senior manager, how do you become vice president without asking for, I want that job? You have
Yeah,
to apply for it if
right.
it's
Yeah,
either advertised internally or it's not, but somehow you have to let people know, yeah, I wouldn't mind being vice president,
yeah.
right?
I think there's differences in the nuances, between ambition and striving and pursuit of excellence and interested in developing and expanding oneself, and there's a whole bunch of things. What I was saying about ambition, it's not that ambition itself is wrong. I'm saying that the attribute of that word has different connotations. But absolutely, you need to ask for it. Women are less likely to proactively ask for those things because they've been culturalized that it looks bad on them because of that attribution of ambition, right? They still will. The but we have to, and I've had experiences myself with this. I've had conversations with friends, community members that are so blatantly sexist. It blows my mind. And these individuals wouldn't even see themselves as sexist. They
Could you
just
have
don't get it.
give an example, or without naming names, or it's just sort of implied sexism kind of thing?
It's unconscious, it's subconscious sexism because of culturalized stereotypes. It's kind of the example is, the behavior conducted by a man is seen as one way: strong, confident, assertive. The same behavior in the same situation conducted by a woman is seen as bitchy, aggressive, nasty. You know what I mean? Like there's like a negative
And that might come up in a performance
flavor.
review or something.
It comes up in performance reviews. It comes up in terms of reputation. It comes up just at cocktail parties.
Just the whisper in the lunchroom kind of thing, or
Right.
by the water cooler.
Right. And so that's a challenge for women, is how do we do that and recognize. So we have to also be thoughtful that we as women can't enter into that conversation.
Right. Attacking each other kind of thing.
Right, which is known as the crabs in the barrel phenomenon, right? Which is a group of people within the same marginalized class start to actually have hierarchical fighting within that same group, and that can happen, and we need to be really careful about that, because also patriarchy benefits from infighting with women.
Yes.
Benefits, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Just take each other out.
yeah.
So I stumbled across a McKinsey report, and the top 3 reasons why women leaders switch jobs. And you can chime in if you want. So number 1, women leaders want to advance, but they face stronger headwinds than men. 2, women.
So, and I don't know what the headwinds that they're going to articulate there, but that's a great example of the difference between equality and equity, right? So equality might be man and woman is here. They have the same opportunities to move forward, but if a woman has stronger headwinds, right, It's going to be harder for
Yep.
her to move forward than the men.
They say in many companies, women experience microaggressions that undermine their authority and signal that it would be harder for them to advance. For example, they are far more likely than men in leadership to have colleagues imply that they aren't qualified for their jobs, and women leaders are twice as likely as men leaders to be mistaken for someone more junior.
Yes, that is true.
So you just assume someone walks in and you assume they're
Yes,
an assistant or
that's
something.
true, and that happens
Yeah.
in lots of different industries and sectors. I
Yes.
can say this happens a lot in healthcare. Right, a female physician or a surgeon walks in.
Where's the real doctor?
Where's the doctor?
Right.
Thank you, nurse. Where's the doctor? I'm the surgeon. Right? Still happens.
Yes.
Happens in the
Absolutely.
corporate world all the time.
Yes. And that's just what ingrained, I guess. It's just
The cycle of socialization. That's what I was saying. It's culturally, and men and women do it just as much as men do,
right.
because we've been raised to through the way we're socialized, including media. All of this stuff comes in, and we just keep, it socializes us to have these. So we have to be really thoughtful about recognizing some of these biases as they come up, and we make assumptions. We go, where did that come from? That's interesting. So, as you know, Jim, like one of the fundamental behaviors or practices that I am a vocal advocate for is cultivating a reflective mindset. And when you cultivate a reflective mindset, it means you're deeply curious and interested in how you perceive the world and what are the filters and biases and assumptions that go through and stereotypes and stigma that go through your own brain as you perceive the world. And we all do that, even when they don't match up with our ideologies.
Yep. So why women leaders are switching jobs? Point 2, women leaders are overworked and under-recognized. Compared with men at their level, women leaders do more to support employee well-being and foster DEI, work that dramatically improves retention and employee satisfaction, but is not formally rewarded in most companies.
Right. So, yeah, diversity, equity, and inclusion is the DEI, otherwise known as EDI. Sometimes they move the letters around. The bulk of the work is done by women, probably because they are part of a marginalized group. So maybe it is a easier space to recognize. That I'm not sure of, but. Yeah, my experience and observation is women work harder for the same job for less pay. And there's a lot of, because of that, self-imposed in many cases, it becomes just assumed. It just becomes expected. Here's a great example. You can be at a corporate event. You can be at a corporate management leadership party or a meeting, and there's talk of some sort of social event. 100%, the planning of said event will fall to a woman. They'll be like, hey, Susan, could you, right? The men will never say, I will take care of planning this event. It's just assumed that a woman, well, you're better at that.
Right.
Right? And so all this extra work now is going to fall on that woman because women are better at planning parties.
Well, also, when I read that support employee well-being, I mean, that could just be a phone call with a colleague after hours, right? Because my wife gets calls like that on a Saturday afternoon, or they just went to a conference and then there's the phone call at 7 p.m. and it's like, and they're debriefing or was this really mean or what,
Yep.
And they're supporting each other, but it's after work hours.
Yes.
So,
That's a great example.
So
It's a great example.
So point number 3, why women leaders are switching jobs. Women leaders are seeking a different culture of work. Women leaders are significantly more likely than men leaders to leave their jobs because they want more flexibility or because they want to work for a company that is more committed to employee well-being and the DEI.
Yeah. Agreed. Because companies say it, but they don't do it.
What could be done to make International Women's Day better? It started in 1909, apparently. The earliest reported Women's Day observance, called National Women's Day, was held in February 1909 in New York City, organized by the Socialist Party of America. And by the 21st century, International Women's Day has been criticized as being heavily diluted and commercialized, particularly in the West, where it is sponsored by major corporations and used to promote general and vague notions of equality rather than radical social reform. So it started here and is now here. It's been kind of co-opted by that was sort of what we were talking about at the very beginning. How can we what would you do to make it better? How can you?
I will just say,
is it meaningful?
Yeah, I will say that I think that that's happened in all aspects of social justice. Social justice itself has been co-opted politically and corporately in this sort of corporate woke space. And this is one aspect, I think, of the social justice milieu that has also been, as you say, it's sort of hijacked. I think, the list that Sophie articulates is a great place to start. I think, as I mentioned earlier, if there was two things, one individually and one collectively. Individually, to use International Women's Day as an opportunity to make a commitment to invest 20 minutes individually to learn about why is there a need for recognition, celebration, voice, conversation around the inequity or inequality of genders. So if I don't know, then take some time to learn about it in a non-binary, non-political way, right? I'm not going to go to the far left and I'm not going to go to the far right. I'm actually going to look at everything and say, what is from 1909 or before, what does this all mean? So that I'm not just ingesting the stuff that I see on my social media feeds and on mass media. And to then reflect, either I am a woman, how does my life reflect equality and equity or not? How do the other women in my life reflect equity and equality or not? What are some small, micro, daily decisions and choices that we could make that would make it better? So having, and maybe having conversations. You mentioned earlier, you have a wife, you have 2 daughters. What conversation might you invite with them to say, hey, what does this mean to you? What would be meaningful to you? What if you could do something tangible to shift things? What would that look like? To really learn from an open, exploratory, curious mindset. That would be cool. Collectively, as I mentioned earlier, if International Women's Day was an opportunity for an organization to say, we're going to take a pause today. The company's not going to go belly up if we take one day to take a pause, and maybe it's a week, but to take a pause and actually reflect on the commitments that we've made, not just last year, but the commitments that we make in our language of values, in our stated values as a corporation. It's usually around equality and respect and inclusiveness and innovation and all that stuff. How do we actually behave in accordance with our usual HR policies around inclusion, diversity, equity, parental leave, harassment? Because oftentimes the policies are in place, but they are not. But the policies don't mean anything because we know that what actually happens around here isn't that stuff.
Right.
So to actually review this in a vulnerable, honest way, and I would suggest with some sort of third-party arbiter, whether it's an internal ombudsman committee, whatever, or maybe it's a third party, to hold, and obviously organizations and leaders of those organizations have to be willing to do that. And it's ugly sometimes. Because it's easy for us all to say we have values. We're humans. Humans aren't perfect. We all say things and then do other things, myself and yourself included. But it takes courage and it takes vulnerability, but it also takes commitment and it takes real leadership to say, yeah, we're actually gonna take some time and have a hard look in the mirror about whether we are actually doing what we say we believe in, or if it's really just a marketing thing and we're full of it. There's a lot of really good evidence that shows that companies are more sustainable and more profitable over time.
Yes.
And maintain employee engagement
Yes.
and retention when they, in fact, do focus on employee health and well-being, and not just the performative stuff.
If they're smart, because
right?
because it costs a lot of money to train someone new from scratch.
Yeah.
And you're just chucking out someone
And
with 10 years
especially-
experience.
And
you know.
especially now, there's an employee crisis,
Yeah.
right? Quiet quitting is real. People can't hire people. I talk to people in all different sectors of work.
They can't find people.
I can't find people.
Right.
Because people are saying, I don't want to work in a toxic environment. I don't want to do it. So something needs to shift, and,
Right.
and organizations have to see that as it's actually good for business to incorporate human-centered leadership practices,
That's
to
why
incorporate
people-
human-centered practices.
People in the interview process are now asking more pointed questions about
Yeah.
company culture,
Yeah.
et cetera. Right.
Yeah.
So
And what we have to be clear about too is as we develop young people and young professionals, to let them know that it's not about that this is not at the expense of accountability. It's not at the expense of being committed, of being responsible, of being accountable. Because then people say, "Oh, well, they just make this. It's all ping pong tables and unicorns, and I can just call in whenever I want and go, I don't feel well today. I'm having a self-care moment." Like this happens, right?
Right.
At the same time, when you do it thoughtfully and avoid the either or thinking, you can actually create a way where you can leverage the incredible creative problem solving and collaborative learning culture that you only get when you synergize people from different perspectives, areas of expertise, generations, backgrounds, thinking styles, etc. What an incredible thing to do. And you know what? This is the other thing. We make our whole identities and our whole life, the whole definition of success is what do you do for work? People are kind of tired of that.
Yeah.
I know I am.
Yeah.
If I was just about money, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. I'd be working in some corporation, be high on the, right? But like you literally couldn't pay me enough.
Catherine, thanks for coming. I can't keep you all day. But,
No. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's always fun.
So
I'm hoping another post in the future will trigger you to invite me again.
just keep posting. Keep posting. It could be a weekly show.
Sure.